been teaching the Middle Ages of church history, or the Dark Ages, however you want to put it. I called it the Dark Ages because it just sounds ominous and more interesting. But it's the Middle Ages of church history, and I've done a lesson or two in here before, so you understand kind of what we're doing. And a major part of this had to do with the rise of Islam and the Crusades. In fact, if you ask somebody on the street, tell me what you know about the Middle Ages, one of the few things that will come up, perhaps, are the Crusades. And of course, the Crusades are an embarrassment to Christians. It's something atheists and skeptics like to bring up to show, in their opinion, faults of the church and where the church went wrong and how bad the church is. And it's a blight on history. I mean, it's warfare in the name of Jesus Christ. And that's not what Jesus called for at all. And I'll go over some verses about that in just a moment. At the same time, we recognize that the church waging the wars of the Crusades was not the biblical church. And weeks leading up to this have demonstrated that time and time again. The church that was waging the Crusades and calling for military warfare in the name of Jesus Christ was not the church you read about in the Bible. And so it might be an embarrassment to the medieval church, but it's not an embarrassment to the biblical New Testament church that Jesus established. Jesus never called upon His disciples to fight with swords to spread the good news about Him. That might have been Islam's way. That might have been the way of the Roman Catholic Church and the Byzantines. It might have been the way of even the reformers after them, but it's not the way of Christ's disciples. And so we understand the confusion out there, but there's no need for New Testament Christians to feel embarrassed about this. We do need to know what it was all about. And so I'm going to start that discussion. I don't think that there's any way I can totally talk about the Crusades in one class. So we'll start the discussion and see how far we get this morning. And last week in my class, we talked about the rise of Islam. 7th century, Islam came very quickly into the world and rose very quickly to power. Around that time, Gregory the Great, regarded as one of the first powerful popes, he was Pope in Rome. His dates are like 590 to 604. And then around that time, Muhammad was born. He says that he received revelation from Gabriel, the angel. He delivered it as the last prophet, and that became the Quran, and called on people to follow him in his allegiance to Allah. And many people answered the call. A lot of this had to do with political unrest. A lot of it had to do with a dissatisfaction with the idols and polytheism that were a part of Arabia before this. A lot of it had to do with the desire to unite the Arabian tribes, and Muhammad was able to do that, coming back to Mecca in 630 and establishing a large Muslim kingdom. Now it looks like this, and the darkest area is the area established by Muhammad in just a few years. He had to run away from Mecca in 620, if I have my dates right, and by 10 years later, basically, he had come back to Mecca victorious, having united everybody, and he was dead a couple of years later. So that darkest area is the area that he established, and then you see it spread into the lighter shade of purple, and then the lightest shade that goes all the way from Spain into Western Asia. That's a very different looking map than what it looked like when you're talking about the Roman Empire just a century before. So the Roman Empire, especially in the East, was being weakened by the Islamic people who were conquering in the name of Allah all over the Middle East. And Palestine, including Jerusalem, was taken in 638. Syria and Egypt, which were once very heavily Christian, were now, as you can see on that map, Muslim territories. And even today, If you say Egypt, people don't think Christian, they think Muslim. If you say Syria, the last religion they think of is Christianity. They think Islam. And so all of this happened in the 7th century. And as you can imagine, the Roman Empire, which is now not the empire of the classical ages, but this Holy Roman Empire established by Europeans under Charlemagne and those after him, these folks did not like this. They wanted their holy lands back that had always belonged to the Romans before. And so they started thinking about how to deal with these Muslims. Now, one of the reasons the Holy Lands were so important to the medieval church in Europe is because of pilgrimages. Were you ever forced to read the Canterbury Tales when you were in high school or college maybe, and you read about these Christians taking pilgrimages? What's that all about? Well, the pilgrimages were a form of penance. And if you remember some of our discussions about the medieval church in the Middle Ages, penance was something that you did to make up for your sins. It was punishment that you brought upon yourself in the place of God bringing it on you. And it may be to say so many prayers or to fast for this period of time, or it may be a pilgrimage. And pilgrimage was maybe the highest form of penance because it was so hard and dangerous and expensive. And so a lot of Christians would make pilgrimages to the Holy Lands, namely Jerusalem, or to sites where supposedly relics were located. And when they came back, if they returned safely, they were regarded almost as saints recognized by the church. They were highly regarded. And so the pilgrimages were made. And for many centuries after Muhammad, there was peaceful enough relations between Christians and Muslims where Christians were allowed into the Holy Lands controlled by the Muslims for their pilgrimages. And if you remember our discussion of Islam last week, the Muslims regarded Adam and Noah and Moses and Abraham and Jesus as prophets, and so they had friendly enough relations with the Christians, but all of that changed with the rise of a particular brand of military Islam called the Seljuk Turks. I think I got a map on them. Now the Seljuk Turks came about, let me get the date on that, 11th century. And they were far less permissible than their forebears, especially with regard to Christians. Before them, Asia Minor still belonged to the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, if you want to look like that. Constantinople was located there at the western end of Asia Minor. And you can see the Seljuk Turks took that over along with a lot of Eastern Asia. And they were not very friendly to Christians at all and stopped allowing them peaceful transit into the areas of pilgrimage. And so the old Byzantine Empire was reduced to little more than Greece. And in desperation, the Emperor of Constantinople sent word to Christians of Western Europe asking them for aid. Come and save your brothers and sisters in the church from these Turks that have taken over the Holy Lands and even the Eastern Roman Empire. And so they answered the call. The Western Church began sending warriors down in the Crusades to fight for the Holy Lands. Now the word crusade means taking the cross. And people on their way to crusades would wear clothing that they had sewn crosses into on the front. And generally speaking, when they were going to the Crusades, they would wear the cross in the front. When they were leaving the Crusades, if they were fortunate enough to do so, they would wear the cross on their back. So taking the cross, and the idea was we're taking the cross back to Jerusalem, back to Israel, back to Palestine, where it belongs, back to the Holy Lands. This was not pure New Testament Christianity. I told you we'd go over some verses about that. Let's do that now. You remember when a coin was brought to Jesus and he was asked, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Do you remember Jesus' answer to that question? Whose inscription is on it? Caesar's. And he said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. And so there was a separation between the church and the state in that statement. Some things are God's, taxes and necessary governmental obligations are there, but your life is not primarily a political government life. That was the answer that Jesus gave. But the Crusades were fought under different premises. Also, before Pilate kept asking Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? What he meant by that is, are you a political earthly king set up as a rival to the Roman emperor? And Jesus denied it, and he said in John 18:36, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not of this world. And we often just shorten that to his saying, my kingdom is not of this world. But pay close attention to what he's saying. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not of this world. And so Jesus was not calling on his servants to fight with the sword, the enemies of Christ. Later on in 2 Corinthians 10, Paul says the weapons of our warfare are not flesh and blood, but he says they're arguments that are lifted up to destroy every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. In other words, the Word of God is the sword of the Spirit. It's not a sword made of steel, but of God's powerful Word. That's the kingdom that Jesus established, and this is a very different situation. One of the most influential speeches of church history, Pope Urban II gathered people together to start the First Crusade. And here's some of the words from that speech. He said, your Eastern brothers have asked for your help. Turks and Arabs have conquered their territories. Or rather, the Lord begs you, destroy that vile race from their lands. So he's calling for genocide, basically. They're in those lands. They don't belong there. And it's not just me, but God is calling on you to go down there, begging you to go down and destroy those people. He continues, for this land which you inhabit is too narrow for your large population, nor does it abound in wealth, and it furnishes scarcely food enough for its cultivators. Hence it is that you murder and devour one another, enter upon the road to the holy sepulchre, wrest that land from the wicked race, and subject it to yourselves. Now, does this sound like just a war fought for spiritual reasons? That betrays some materialistic goals in mind in the call to go down there and fight. And so here we have some stated reasons for the Crusades, and then we have some other reasons. Let's go to the stated reasons. Number one, to win back the Holy Lands. To go down, take Jerusalem and the surrounding areas and the places of the holy relics away from the Muslims. Number two, check the advance of Islam. Islam was a competing religion. It was not the true religion. And so convert at the point of a sword, just like they were doing. And then number three, heal the division between the church in the East and in the West. You know that through doctrinal disagreements and disagreements that are political in nature, the church had split around 1054, forming the Western Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Eastern Orthodox Church had its own patriarch or leader. The Roman Catholic Church had the Pope, and they had become divided. The idea that the Pope, who wanted to be universal bishop, had was that through this, if we save the East, then I can become leader of the church all over the world once and for all. Now, if these are the stated reasons, and if accomplishing them marked the success of the Crusades, then it was a complete and utter failure. Because in the end, they did not win back the Holy Lands, they did not check the advance of Islam, and they did nothing but widen the gap between the Eastern Christians and the Western Christians. It was very unsuccessful. By the way, I meant to say this before. When we talk about the Crusades, we're talking about a period of about 500 years. If you want to just make it easy, from about 1000 to 1500, the end of the Middle Ages, right before the Reformation. And there, depending on how you count them, 7, 8, or 9 crusades. I'm going to look at 7. I'm combining what's often called the fifth and sixth crusades, because these things didn't happen as organized as historians outline them. So 7, 8, 9, however you count them, they were wars that were fought near the end of the Middle Ages. Now, those are the stated reasons, but here are some of the other reasons that you might say here were the real reasons. Number one, there was a famine in the Western Empire that created economic distress. And so the thought was, we can go, and you saw this in some of Pope Urban's speech here, going back to it. We have a large population. Our population does not abound in wealth, and there is scarcely food enough for the cultivators. So it sounds like he's interested in some economic relief. Number two, many men were eager to go on a crusade, hoping to reestablish themselves financially, which is related to number one. Go down and find fortunes. It's kind of like the gold rush. There were tales about great riches and resources in the Holy Lands to be had by anybody who could get down there and fight the Muslims. Number three, some were interested in plunder and setting themselves up as feudal lords in territories they hoped to take from the Muslims. They were under a feudal system in Europe by this point, meaning there were noblemen who were very wealthy and in control of a lot of lands, and they would invest those lands to lower people who would work the land in return. And some people wanted to be on top, but there was no room for them in Europe. And they thought, well, if I can go down and conquer some land in a new place, then I can set myself up as a wealthy landowner and have people under me. Others were interested in developing easier trade with the Near East, and if the Crusades accomplished anything, that might have been one accomplishment, because there was routes of trade that were opened up after that. Some were seeking adventure. They were just bored, if you can imagine, especially young men without family ties, and they heard about exciting adventures to be had in the Middle East. They eagerly went out there to fight wars and to find thrills. And still others went to escape punishment for crimes. In fact, the people instigating crusades often went to criminals and gave them leniency or clemency if they would go and fight these wars. And the thinking was, well, these are the most violent people around us. Who better to go fight a war than violent war criminals? So they would release them from prison or wherever they were and send them out into the Middle East, hopefully to conquer the Muslims. That was the idea. Okay, so that's a general introduction to the Crusades, as best as I can give it. Any questions so far on that? I miss anything that maybe you thought I should mention? I have to admit, I didn't know a whole lot about this before last week, so I'm just one week ahead of you on this. Let's talk about the Crusades now, just numbering them in order. And like I said, I'm breaking them down into 7 crusades. And the first one was probably the most familiar. 1092 is the opening date for the First Crusade. The Byzantine emperor at this time was Alexius I. He saw an opportunity to gain a victory over the Turks if he could obtain support from the West. so again, this gets to the divide between the empires and the churches. There was a smaller Eastern Empire headquartered in Constantinople, a larger Western Empire headquartered at, well, it was originally in Rome and later into areas of France and Germany. And so the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire hoped to maybe establish better relations. The Eastern Emperor appealed to Pope Urban II, the guy we were quoting a minute ago, and asked him to help him drive the Turks out of the Holy Land. The Roman Emperor at this time was a guy named Henry IV. So Pope Urban called on Christians to push back the conquest of Islam at the Council of Clermont. This is in France in 1095. And those excerpts from his speech were on that date, 1095, and many answered the call. Now, some of the people who answered the call to go fight in the Crusades were people who were desired, and then some of them were people who were not desired. This is a map of the Crusades I'll keep going back to. I know it's impossible for you to see the details of it, but you can kind of just see the movements maybe, and I'll be going back and forth between that. Here's one of the undesirables, a guy named Peter the Hermit. He prided himself in never taking baths, so he was kind of the pigpen of the Middle Ages. But Peter the Hermit had a lot of influence. He was one of the monks, and you know, monks were some of the most highly regarded spiritual leaders of the time. And he said, you know, you're going after these noblemen and asking them to leave their families and leave their wealth to risk their lives in the East. I can gather together a huge army of peasants. And he did. He got 20 to 30,000 peasants to follow him to the holy wars. The problem was they weren't very educated. They didn't have, you know, modern weapons of warfare. They were using pitchforks and sticks and things, or their bare fists. They were not good people in a lot of cases. Not that any of these people were ideal, but they were really rough. And they had no organization, no military skills. And so it was a complete disaster when he led them into areas on what is known as the People's Crusade. They went to Constantinople, and the results were absolutely dreadful, just disastrous. Other desirable elements came in the form of a new development in monasticism. And this was militarized orders of monks called knights. Now, you're familiar with knights. You may not have realized that knights came out of monasticism. They were basically militarized monks. And there were a couple of orders that may sound familiar to you, maybe not. This is a depiction of the Knights Templar. The word Templar comes from the word for temple. The idea was they're going to go and defend Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. So they come out of the Crusades. They have their, you can see the red cross on their chest, emblazoned on their chest. That was kind of one of their signs. They were founded in 1118, and they were some of the fiercest warriors during the Crusades. Here's another order of knights. I may say this wrong, Hospitallers. The Hospitallers comes from the word for hospital, which came from the word for hospitality. During the pilgrimages, these hospitals were established along the road for Christians to stop and get food and rest. Later, governments started taking over welfare and feeding the hungry and the poor, and they began to just focus on the sick, which is why we call our places for the sick today hospitals. Well, the Knights Hospitallers, they came out of that movement and also were like the Knights Templar warriors in the Crusades, and they were also known as the Knights of St. John. And so these are just two orders. There were others that came along later. These were two of the first. And the Knights Hospitallers had the white cross, as you see the guy on the left wearing on his robe. Some of the Crusaders were organized, some of them were not well organized. The organized portion was led by noblemen from France, Belgium, northern Italy, and their leaders, their armies arrived in Constantinople in 1094. They took the town of Nicaea, which you recognize from the Council of Nicaea, and then marched into Antioch. When they got to Antioch, they ran into a fresh army of Turks and were starting to be defeated until somebody yelled something about, "We have found the spear used by the Roman soldier to pierce the side of our Lord." And that rejuvenated the armies, and they fought back the Turks, and the Turks were forced to withdraw from Antioch. They marched on to Jerusalem, and they were able to take Jerusalem from the Turks in 1099. Now, historians say a lot of this success in the First Crusade was due to unrest among the Turks. Always remember, and this is with either side, Christians, Muslims, there's always unrest within and without. And usually the unrest within is what takes people down. So right now the Christians were fresh, they were newly unified, and the Turks were having some unrest among them, as they often did whenever they conquered new territories. For a while, the main conqueror was successful. He dies, and then there's a fight over who's in charge next. The Christians caught them in that state, and so they were able to get Jerusalem in 1099. Of the 30,000 to 50,000 who went on the First Crusade, 4,000 to 10,000 reached Jerusalem. In Asia Minor, they were either massacred or taken prisoner or sold as slaves by the Turks. Many others died from disease and starvation. What's interesting about this First Crusade is it led to the establishment of 4 Crusader states. And on that map, if you can look at Palestine and the areas to the north and south of it, you'll see the areas in orange. These are the Crusader states. So they were Muslim territories until 1099, after the First Crusade, and these 4 states were established. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, the county of Tripolis, the Principality of Antioch, and the county of Edessa. So these 4 states were newly organized and were kind of a part of the Holy Roman Empire. That was the idea. And that's just a really interesting idea to me, that you have Rome, you have maybe in Greece remnants of a Byzantine Empire, and then a whole lot of Muslim territory. And then in Palestine, you have these 4 states that were kind of a part of the Roman Empire still. That was something I really hadn't thought much about. But there were rulers from the west in there, and they had conquered that territory. And the intention, of course, was to spread that and make it larger, although they never got to that point. So that's the First Crusade. We got about 6-7 minutes, so I'll cover the next one and then maybe stop there. So the Second Crusade was launched from Europe again, and it was called in 1145 in response to the fall of the county of Edessa. Now, Edessa is the northernmost province of these 4 Crusader states. And so, it was taken, and the Turks reorganized, and they took it back. So in response to that, Pope Eugene III, and probably more influential, this monk called Bernard of Clairvaux, promoted the Second Crusade. And one of the things that really got people moving on this was the Pope promised forgiveness to anyone who went on these crusades. And there was one king, King Louis VII of France, who was really interested in this, because King Louis had burned a church down with 1,300 people in it. And he was feeling kind of guilty about that. And so he decided, I'll go on this crusade and I'll get people to go. And the Pope says, I can even be forgiven for burning a church down with 1,300 people in it. So Louis VII, he went, and many others who wanted forgiveness of their sins. And you can see the corruption and that the religious leaders had devolved into, and the power they wielded just with this promise of forgiveness, which doesn't come from any religious leader, but only Jesus Christ. So under the leadership of Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, the crusade began favorably, but it ended in miserable failure with thousands killed in Asia Minor. They were able to reach Damascus, which is in Syria and in the area of Edessa. They got there, and after a siege of a few days, became discouraged and returned home. Now, this brings us to a Muslim leader who was the most famous. This is Saladin, and Saladin was the greatest Muslim leader of the Crusades, maybe in history. One of the greatest leaders of the Middle Ages, hands down. He's up there with any Roman emperor or any church leader in terms of his military prowess, his political abilities. And another thing that made him unusual was that for a conqueror, he could be a forgiving person. He was interested in peace, and he brought peace, and he made treaties with the Christians in the West and settled disputes in ways other than warfare, but he was able to do that because he was so powerful. He was named Caliph in 1174. He unified the Muslims, preaching jihad against Christians, and he retook Jerusalem in 1187 at the end of the Second Crusade. It's said that when Pope Urban III heard the news of the capture of Jerusalem, he died of shock, and so that's how the Second Crusade went. It was really a disaster in the end. Any questions? We've got about 5 minutes here. I can either... Saladin, Saladin. Mm-hmm.
I had one coworker that said, how can you follow that? That was done by a king who really wanted things in there to his own benefit. And I didn't know if you knew anything about that. I really did not know what to answer to something like that. Since you were talking about that
kings and their power, it's related. The last class of the quarter, I hope to talk about English translations a little bit, because those began to come into being near the end of the Middle Ages. So the King James translation was commissioned by King James, but it's a translation, and it wasn't translated by kings or people in power, but a group of scholars, which has made it so influential. One of the reasons people use it today is because it is a good translation. So the question, is kind of a loaded question and a misunderstanding of what it is. It's not a political document. The King James Bible is a translation from the original Hebrew and Greek languages into, 17th century English. And if the King James all translations have flaws, because human beings are trying to get, the original languages into equivalence, but everything you need to know that God has given you can be learned from the King James Bible. The biggest flaw that it has is it's 400 years old, and English has changed a little bit since then. So the answer is, hey, this is a translation. A number of Greek and Hebrew scholars have put their stamp of approval on it. 400 years have passed, and nobody in the know says that this is a political document like propaganda. It's a translation of the Bible. I don't know.
That's kind of what I answer, that we have enough people too that have tried to look back at the original documents and sort of compare, and that's why that is one of the Bibles that is used the most, because it is most accurate to the translations of the Hebrew from the original documents.
Well, and I think what this gets into, to tie it back into some of the things we're talking about here, is we do things differently today than they did in 1600 or in, 1054 or whenever. State, in America especially, the state isn't, the American government would never commission the translation of a Bible. They would never do that. And so it's strange to us to hear that King James commissioned the translation of a Bible. And we're suspicious of that kind of relationship between the church and state, basically because we're Americans. And, we've been taught Thomas Jefferson's separation of church and state since we were kids. But that's just the way things were done then. If you were going to get an English translation of the Bible and not be burned at the stake for it, you went through the proper channels, which in England was the King of England. If you went off on your own and translated the Bible into the common language, you would be on the run for your whole life, which many people were, and made sacrifices that led to the date when King James authorized a Bible, which is why it's called the authorized edition. It's not authorized by God. It's not authorized by the church. It's authorized by King James. And I think people who are really fond of King James like to call it the authorized, but it was authorized by the government. But that's the way they did things then. And we do them differently now. But the only way you could have gotten an English translation of the Bible distributed as well as it was through the proper channels. Yeah, Brian.
You called him a caliph, and I'm going to assume that caliphate means kingdom. So is that what they're trying to do today? Put together back all things on the map that were yellow and orange?
Yeah, that's the caliphate. A caliph, though, I use that word in terms of a recognized successor of Muhammad.
Oh, it doesn't mean king?
And so, it kind of, but king in the sense of you're a successor to Muhammad's reign or Muhammad's position. Of course, the Muslims haven't agreed on who's the proper caliph since Muhammad died. But that's what caliph means in its basic sense, is successor to Muhammad. The Sunnis agree on one caliphate, the Shias agree on a different caliphate, and so that's how the branches formed. Saladin was a Sunni, which is the majority of Muslims today. 90% of Muslims are Sunnis. So, if you have more questions, too bad, the bell rang. Just kidding.
So what's the yellow part of the map? Is that what you're saying?
Yellow part of the map?
Can you go back to the map?
Go, okay, let's see. Well, my clicker quit working. I'm not joking this time. Okay, this one?
Yeah, down at the bottom. So the yellow part, is that the caliphate?
Yeah, those are the Seljuk Turks, which were Sunnis at the time. Now that's changed now, but the Seljuks that kind of started the militarized version of the Crusades on the Muslim side, Saladin was one of them. That was his territory, give or take. Okay, thank you.